Welcome to the Perspective Knoll, a home to original fantasy stories. Videos are uploaded once a week, feel free to like and subscribe. Enjoy the journey. Chapter 10. Servants of Errol. Charles was still standing in the middle of the bedroom on the second level of Camel's house, and was still eyeing the piece of paper with the symbol representing some god on it. Dale was still floating there beside him, and he too seemed to be processing the situation. Charles let out a long sigh and shook his head. I don't have time for another mystery. I need to get to the Western Kingdom so that I can find someone to help me get Shawn away from Jolene. Charles then looked at Dale and in return gave a sharp look. These folks need help, the help of a lawman. How could you let a child just be taken and for all we know be sacrificed for the greater good of some god? Child kidnapping is not something any god wants in their name, but Errol has always had a different mindset on what he thought was a way to pledge one's allegiance. Dale seemed a little irritated with Charles, and almost struck with disbelief that the words had even left his lips that Charles would be willing for fate alone to decide if the child lives or not. You have the ability, Charles, and you have the means to change these people's lives for the better. You're not going to abandon them and leave them to a scarred life, are you? With those words, it was hard to simply turn away from the case. Charles looked around and back to the desk and went through a few scenarios in his mind how things could go, whether he left them behind or if he stayed and helped. Nothing good ever came from my life being a selfish person, said Charles as he took the paper with the symbol of Errol Minna on it. I'll show her this and see how she reacts to it. She might not be a victim, but a part of the whole scheme to lead me on a dead trail. Good thinking, said Dale as his posture changed and was much more relaxed. Charles walked down the stairs and there waiting for him was a man he had never seen before, nor did he look too happy. He wore a thick vest and no undershirt and his pants had chunks of wood around the bottom edges, his shoes were greatly worn. Charles noticed Camille standing behind the man and with her arms folded and glaring at Charles. He assumed that it was Turin, Camel's husband. Who are you? Asked the man and his tone was less than friendly. My name is Charles. I'm a detective and I'm trying to assist this woman here in locating her child. Charles stepped back and was nearly leaning against the wall beside the stairs. All the detectives are worthless. Ever since the lawmen have gone away or have died, the crimes around the world have gone up to an unimaginable height. Charles could feel the frustration in Turin's tone. Look, I am a lawman. I can prove it to you, just give me a chance. You're lying. The man clenched his fist and made like he was going to swing at Charles but held back. You need to leave and leave now while you're still able to. Yes, of course, I apologize to you and everyone. Else, Charles cleared his throat and then sidestepped to reach the doorknob and quickly exited the building. He casually walked onto the road and headed in the direction of the town where he first saw Camille and Mayara. He began to shake a bit and he knew that it was because of the confrontation that could have gone bad moments ago. Charles could hold his own, but it was anyone's guess as to how good these Lufforain's fighting styles were. The square was still quiet and as Charles looked around, he could not help but notice something. There were plenty of houses around and shops and yet it just sounded too quiet. Occasionally, he could see a pair of eyes looking out from a shop window and then would turn away as soon as they locked eyes. Charles then had a thought. He didn't want to leave Camel's infant to whatever fate these people are going to give it. If he couldn't get their permission to help them, then he'd have to do it anyway. There was a shop on his right and what appeared to be a small alleyway that may have run along the rear of Camel's backyard. Charles made his way in between the building and a tall set of bushes that lined the entire path. At the end of the shop, he stopped and damn near jumped out of his skin. A large man had just rounded the corner and he was carrying, in a sack over his shoulder, a massive fish. Whoa! What are you doing back here? The man asked. Sorry, I was just looking for something that flew over a friend's fence. Have you seen anything? It was a cover and not the best one he had come up with, but the vaguer he was, the more time he could allow himself to elaborate if questions persisted. Well, it's an alley and to be honest there are lots of random things that come and go out here. The man paused and looked at Charles up and down. Odd-looking clothes you have there. That's not the clothes of us Westerners. Oh, no, it's Far East. Yes, that's where I come from. Have you ever been Far East? Charles was hoping for a no to his question. The man swung the sack off his back and placed it on the ground. He wiped his forehead and smeared the sweat that was trickling down onto his eyebrows. No, I haven't had the luck of leaving Jordan's post in my life. My name's Nat Hun, pleased to meet you. And you, I'm Charles and I. Well, I've been around. I'm not one to stay in one place for too long. Charles rubbed the back of his neck, and at least with those words he was telling the truth. This place, sure it's small and quiet, but it's what I'm used to. My wife Phaneira loves it, and she too has lived here her whole life. Nat Hun gave a sigh. Truth is, ever since I was a boy, I've wanted to see what the world was really about. You know, see all the corners of Lufforain and the people that built it. Nat Hun laughed to himself. Make a friend or two, ones who would always accompany me on my travels. That sounds nice, Nat Hun. The world is a big place and could be dangerous in some parts too. Would you be willing to risk your life for a dream? Asked Charles. To make my dream real? Yes, Nat Hun smiled, and there was a voice that came calling his name from inside the building. Well, that's my boss, got to get to cooking. Hey, before you go, maybe find yourself some new clothes. Jordan's tunic and supplies is across the road there. It might help you fit in a bit. Thanks, I'll do that. Charles had almost walked away but then felt the urge to ask Nat Hun one more question. What can you tell me about this place? What I mean is, why is it so quiet? It's a beautiful day and I'd expect to see children running about. Nat Hun gave a grim expression and his fingers on his left hand began to fidget in his palm. It has something to do with the cultist. They claim to be doing the will of a god, one of the 5 that used to walk in Lufforain. They call themselves the servants of Errol. So, they are a cult that scare people. How so? Charles was tempted to show Nat Hun the hand-drawn image in his pocket of Errol's cult symbol but thought it would be best not to. Let's just say that the guards who watch over Jordan's post are powerless to stop this wave of chaos. They have their own agendas. However, Camille's baby is not the first to be taken by these people. What happens to the infants? Do you know? Charles paused and wasn't sure if he should ask his other question but thought it was job nonetheless. What will happen to Camille's child? Nat Hun did not answer. It seemed painful for him to even think of what may have happened to them. Don't worry about it. Someone will do something. Someday. Creator be with you. Nat Hun finished and swung the sack over his shoulder and entered the belly end full through its back door. Charles felt a genuine connection with Nat Hun, and truly so far, since he has been in this place, he has felt that most people were good. He thought of Camille, and if he could get her baby back, then maybe he'll get paid for his services and buy himself some clothes to better fit in. Charles stared at the empty alley, and since no one was around, he focused on the possibilities of the young man and another person who caught the baby from the window. He kept his eyes focused on the spot just on the other side of the house where they would have left from. Soon a golden orb began to float across the street and past his left, and the next moment, it materialized into the pair of humans running down the road with the new face holding the child. Charles began to follow, and the images kept coming and going like watching a movie with a very weak internet connection. They were traveling down the back sides of the stores and east now. Charles could soon hear water, like a river from up ahead, and the orbs quickly turned left again and to the north. Still running behind the buildings of Jordan's post and along with the river. Charles ran beside them and saw that they were talking to one another but was unable to hear what they were saying. Charles suddenly stopped and noticed that there was a hill now towering over him on his left. The golden mist of the 2 men running had also vanished, and he observed where he was. There were no longer buildings, and the river itself now turned away from him, and the woods again became thick. Charles looked further ahead to see what might be off in the distance, like a house or a bridge that would cross the water. Charles took a stick he found on the ground and tossed it into the river. The stick sank, returned to the surface, but only for a moment before it was dragged away by the current. Too strong to cross on foot, especially with a baby in someone's arms, and the shore on the other side is too far away to toss it safely across, Charles said out loud. He looked further downstream and could not locate a bridge, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't out there somewhere. This is the spot, said Dale as he just popped into existence and was eyeing the river with a smile. Could you not do that, said Charles as he was holding his chest and trying to steady himself. Can you just pop in and out of this world at will? Have you been following me this whole time? Yep, Dale answered and didn't bother to look at Charles as he gave his response. Can all ghosts do what you do? I don't know. I haven't met any ghosts, or have I? Dale pulled out his pip and began stuffing it with tobacco. So, they made it this far. the son Bayrin and the other male still with the baby in hand and running like they were being chased or feared of being chased. Charles scanned the area. So, what's out here? More woods? A small village? You know I haven't seen the wood mill yet where Camel's husband works at. Do you know where that is? Yes, it's on the other side of the road over there, just up the hill to your left. I don't think they'd be heading there anyways, said Dale, who only just now took his eyes off the water and stared at Charles. No, I know. They were still running and following the river. Charles paused and looked back at Dale in hopes that he would answer his previous question if he had known what else could be out here. There might be something, said Dale as he lit up his pipe. Back when I was alive, there was a small fishing depot further down called Nemo's Bait. It was a sort of thrown-together structure made by the man himself, and he did not have skills to do so, but it held up when the weather was bad, and I guess that's all that matters. Charles looked further down the stream and focused on the pair running. Sure enough, the glint of a golden ball sped through the woods 20 yards in front of them and morphed into the ones he was following. Just as soon as they appeared, they vanished again. I need to keep moving. If you want, follow me, but stay where I can see you. By the way, what the hell happened to Harmon? He's a bear, Charles. He can't just walk through a town and not expect someone to raise the alarm of a massive man-eating beast wandering about, can you? He's fine wherever he is, and to answer your other question, yes, I will follow you. I'm very curious to see if you can get to the bottom of this and if you can stay alive. Alive? Asked Charles just before he was about to take a step forward. Well, yes, alive. If these are in fact cultists of Errol, then they are willing to die for his very essence and kill to keep themselves alive for whatever promises they think he will keep for them. Well, that's comforting. Charles rolled his eyes and began on the trail once more. Focusing on the two young men running through the woods, he was able to follow them once more. Charles felt like he was getting a fair amount of exercise in with all this running, but thought it was better than sitting at a desk somewhere pushing a pencil. Dale stayed close behind and floated over the ground with one hand on his pipe. It wasn't but another minute later that Bayrin and the other had stopped running and were at a brisk walk and still following the river. As always, the images flickered and Charles could see them talking to one another, but it remained a silent film and could hear nothing. There it is, said Dale, and Charles looked up the path and saw that there was an oddly built structure up ahead that had a small dock that ran into the river. I think I see someone up ahead. Charles turned around behind a tree and stood there patiently. He waited to see if whoever was at the building had spotted him, and if so, he would wait until they came to him to try anything. Dale, too, moved over to a tree close by and gave Charles an odd look. This is silly, I'm a ghost. What am I hiding for? Dale asked in a whisper. Because I told you that you need to stay where I can see you, Charles whispered back. Did you see how many there were? Looks like 2 by the front door. It faces us, and they were dressed in robes and both holding a halberd, answered Dale. Odd choice of weapon. That's normally used to keep a man on horseback at bay. Well, if not on horse, it can serve as a heavy swinging weapon, but it's slow and not much room to maneuver in the woods here. Halberd? Asked Charles, not sure what Dale was talking about. Yeah, long like spears, but these also have an axe blade near the tip. Still, it's not the kind of weapon for 2 men guarding a small door. They won't stop much, unless it's for the intimidation appeal only. Gotcha. So how do we get around them? Well, I could just disappear and take care of them myself, but you said that I shouldn't do that anymore, Dale said dully and folded his arms. Okay, I take back what I said about you going invisible. If you have a plan, then I say go for it. Charles peeked around the tree he was hiding behind. Nemo's Bait was maybe a football field away, and he did notice the 2 men by the door. Charles looked to the river and thought maybe he could get to the docks by using the river and trying to stay low and fight the current, but it was a long shot, and if the current was as strong as he thought it was, floating on in with minimal sound would be hardly doable. Charles turned back around and looked in Dale's direction and was surprised that he was no longer there. He looked all around for a moment, then he peered out past the tree to Nemo's Bait and waited. Surely Dale had gone to do something about the guards. I'd love to have a gun right now, I could just easily pick them off myself. He thought, and then the feeling of being completely unprotected struck him hard. He had nothing other than his words and his hands to make any kind of a difference. As Charles looked on, it wasn't long before the calmness in the air was interrupted by screams from the 2 men who suddenly dropped their halberds and ran off into the woods. Charles looked about and made sure no alarm was set off by perhaps a third guard that they had missed, but when none came, Charles walked briskly over to the building. He arrived at the building and that's when Dale reappeared, yet again making Charles jump out of his skin. Dale gave a quiet laugh. "I don't think that will ever get old," said Dale, and if he had the ability to, no doubt he would have given Charles a large slap on the back. "So, what happened? How did you get them to run off?" asked Charles. "Simple, I'm a ghost and truth be told, seeing a ghost just appear out of thin air and saying, 'Boo,' is quite terrifying." "Man, I can relate, well that works. Now comes the fun part." Charles tried to look around for a window or another way to enter the building without using the front door. The structure was maybe 10 feet tall and made up of wood and metal side panels placed in no particular order. He walked around to the west side of the building, which was opposite of the river, and there he saw a large window. Before he made his move, he used his ability to see where Bayrin and his accomplice had entered. The orb materialized into the gold, dust-like images, and as expected, the pair of them had used the front door. The pair had talked to the guards and showed them the baby, and the next moment entered the building. "You do know that I'm a ghost, Charles?" asked Dale with a hint of humor. "I can go through walls and see what is happening in there and undetected." Charles looked at Dale and sighed. That seems to be the easy way of it. Charles liked to do things his way, and having a ghost on his side seemed to be a cheat, something that he wasn't ready to give in to. Charles did let his pride get in the way more than once, but reminded him that he had to figure this out as if he was back in his world. "Okay, so what then?" asked Dale. Before Charles could answer, a bright red light showed through the cracks of the door and the ground beneath them began to shake. Charles looked at Dale and he seemed just as shocked as he was, and then action took hold of Charles. He grabbed the large halberd on the ground and broke through the front door. Once inside, the light seemed to blind him at first, but soon dissipated. Once Charles was able to get his bearings, he realized that he was in a large room filled with crates stacked over his head. It was like walking through a maze, and it was hard to see anything beyond them, but Charles could hear just fine. There was a voice speaking, but as if someone was giving a prayer. "Hear this day to Errol I pray. Come forth from the shadows and engulf this child. Your soul will be one with it, and it with you, O God. Come forth now. Your time has come. Belong to us, and claim your kingdom." Charles stopped behind a stack of crates and could tell that the room had opened. He peered around the corner and saw on a wooden table with a large carving on it the very child that he had been pursuing. There were 2 men robed, kneeling before the table with their backs to Charles, and no doubt one of them was Bayrin. The one at the altar was a very thin man yet muscular, and wore only a pair of red pants that were very baggy. This was the man who was speaking, saying the prayer to the god Errol Minna. Also, on the table, Charles could see 2 candles resting on silver stands that stood perhaps 3 feet tall, and the flame was as black as night, and like nothing Charles could have ever imagined. For a second, he got lost in the flame closest to him but shook himself free of its spell. "Come in, my friend, and witness the coming of Errol," said the voice, and then Charles realized that the man behind the table was staring at him. The other 2 who were kneeling turned to get a glimpse of who the other was talking to. Charles did not move out at first, but then his heart fell. Out of the corner of his eyes, he could see 2 other men standing behind him, and they were both holding daggers out in front of them. They were dressed like the guards outside, a robe that was colored in red with thick black accents and thin golden trim. "Drop the weapon," said the one closest to Charles, and this man wore a thin mustache and seemed to have a black eye. Seeing no other way out of this, Charles had no choice. There were 5 other men here and maybe others that he had yet to see. He knew the odds were more than stacked against him, so fighting his way out was not in the cards unless he wanted to die. Charles put his weapon on the ground and placed his hands up. The men both dove towards him and grabbed an arm for themselves and then dragged him to the table. They released him when the one behind the table gave them a slight nod that looked more like a bow. "So, who might you be?" the man asked while clasping his own hands in front of him. "I'm lost. I thought maybe this was Nemo's bait and I'm just looking for directions," answered Charles, his voice a tad shaky. Just looking for directions?" The man paused for a moment, then a sly look came upon him. "So, if you're looking for directions, since when does one need a weapon to ask such a small favor?" Charles was about to answer and knew that the man had already known the truth about why Charles was there. "I'm here for the child. I don't care about the rest of you, but I'm not leaving until I have it." They all laughed, all except for Bayrin, who had a concerned look on his face mixed with confusion. "Well, you're right about one thing, you're not leaving here," the man behind the table spoke. "Forgive me, our guest doesn't know who we are. I'm William and one of the 8 of the servants of Errol's captains. The ones before you are the shadows Bayrin and Dalrus, and the ones who brought you before me are the chains, Jaw and Yamino. So, what does the world call you?" "I'm Charles and I'm a detective, or what you might know as a lawman." Upon those words William's face hardened and whatever little smirk he held had disappeared. "I take it you don't like my kind? Lawmen are dead." "You're lying." William shook his head and looked down at Bayrin and Dalrus. "Careless shadows. Don't you think that maybe someone may have been following you?" "No, of course not. Incompetence is something I should not have to deal with. Errol will deal with you once he gets his body from this world." "So, you're using the child to kill it so that your god can be a part of this world?" asked Charles, trying to piece these cultists together. "Then what? You expect to be praised by him? That doesn't sound like Errol." "Oh, the newcomer thinks he knows it all." William looked down at the child and in turn the child responded with a soft giggle. "No, the child is not slain for Errol. The soul is given, willingly by his captain, meaning myself. In turn, the soul of this child will help keep Errol planted in our physical plane. The child will remain alive, encasing the essence of the god. In doing so, the child will be forever protected by Errol as it grows. In time, this child will become a man and his mind will be linked to Errol's and have all of his powers. Thus, Errol walks in Lufforain again and the world will be his kingdom and us, the servants of Errol, will aid in building his new world." "Why in God's name would you do this?" asked Charles simply, trying not to let his rage get the better of him. "What does Errol plan to do with the world when he is able to walk on it again? And how do you know this outcome?" "Faith," said William, and he returned his gaze to the child and stretched his arms out on either side of him. "We'll both find out one of these days." William began again the same prayer that Charles had heard earlier. There was nothing that Charles could do. There were men behind him with daggers and 2 other young men kneeling and whispering the same words that William was repeating. He did not know where Dale was or what might have happened to him. Then there was the sound of rain hitting the metal roof from above and a large gust struck the building from all sides. The other men were undeterred by this suddenness of the weather, and it felt unnatural, as if it was being made by the servants of Errol themselves. The louder the noise became, the louder William spoke, and his arms began to slowly raise higher as he continued. Then the black flames on both candles on either side of the table grew immensely and were now arching and touching one another. Charles realized why he was so awestruck at the candles in the first place, because it seemed that the little flame showed small stars within them. Now that the flame was as large as the table and hovered over the child, he could see that it was linked to space. The weather now raged outside and threatened to rip apart the roof. The next moment Charles saw a figure within the void. It wore dark tattered robes, and as it swirled about, it reflected a brilliant silver like moonlight. The face was blackened and no features could be seen. The only thing noticeable was a silver crown that appeared to be floating in midair where the head should have been. The child began to scream in a terrifying cry, pleading to let this ghostly figure to be free of his sight. Charles glanced at Bayrin, the child's older brother, and he was stuck in saying the prayer and his eyes were tightly shut. The figure now reached its hand out and that part of its body was now in this world. It reached for the child and Charles' heart was now racing. The hand that was outstretched looked like bone and decaying flesh that was burned. He couldn't believe what was about to happen. Charles closed his own eyes and turned away. He did not want to know what this being, this Errol, had in store after merging its soul with the child's. Crash! A loud noise burst through the bait shop and Charles opened his eyes and saw crates being flung all around. Something was coming their way and it was big and powerful. The next moment a large brown bear came into view and swiped at the 2 men known as the Chains, and they were cut into pieces. It was Harmon, and he looked like a rabid bear on a mission for blood. William had stopped his prayer and eyed Harmon with disgust as if challenging the bear. Harmon did not hesitate and leapt up towards the table, but William was surprisingly fast and dodged out of the way. "Harmon, slow down, don't hurt the child." Charles yelled, and Harmon then realized the being inside the newly formed portal into space. Harmon seemed to be in a trance and everything was silent in the building. That's when Charles took this opportunity to run up to the table and take the child. He began to run but was stopped by an unseen force. He looked around and saw that William had his hands up and was focused on Charles. "You will not take this from me," said William with a crazed look in his eyes. Charles looked behind William and noticed that the flames over the table were now getting smaller, and that the being who must have been Errol was also fading with it. Harmon was still in a trance. Then William began walking towards Charles with his hand still raised and Charles still unable to move. "This is my destiny. To be the one to unleash the old god unto this world and to stand in his wake of the changing of Lufforain. At the cost of an innocent child, that math doesn't add up. Why don't you just give yourself up to Errol?" Charles was hoping William would see to reason, but he already knew that his efforts would fall on deaf ears. This child will live longer than any human before him in the history of the planet. Have the power of Errol himself and claim everywhere as his own lands. It is a gift and you're about to deny this child its purpose. William was about to grab the child from Charles' arms and that's when Bayrin appeared from behind him. He held a large stone in his hand and smacked the back of William's head with it. William fell to the floor and was knocked out cold. Charles was able to move again and turned to face Bayrin. "Why did you do that?" Charles was still trying to catch his breath. "I didn't know," said the boy with tears swelling up in his eyes. "I didn't think that they would sacrifice my brother. I thought he just needed to be present for Errol to come back, but I never thought that Errol needed a body to live in to do so. Kid, the moment you snuck your brother out of your parents' house, you had done a very terrible and unforgivable deed." Charles shook his head. "If you were my son, I'd tell you to offer yourself up to Errol next time." Charles paused for a moment, searching for the right words. "Either way, you'd be no son of mine once it was all said and done." Then Dale appeared and he was looking a bit shocked as he looked around the room. "I'm sorry, Charles, but I wasn't able to get in. You charged the door and I tried to follow, but there was a barrier. A magical shield that surrounded the entire building. I think it was meant to ward off other spirits. So, I found Harmon and told him to break the structure in hopes to lift the spell. He charged through the window on the west side and suddenly I was able to proceed." Charles sighed and looked around. The candles on the table were out and Bayrin and Dalrus sat on the floor staring up at Harmon who was no longer stuck in a trance. "Are you okay, Harmon?" asked Charles. "I'm fine." "What was that thing coming from the space within the flames?" Harmon asked. "I think it was Errol," answered Charles. "He almost got to the baby. Another moment or two and that would have been it. Thanks for coming when you did. Harmon, Dale. Truly thank you. Looks like we dodged this Errol from coming into our world," said Harmon now looking at Bayrin and Dalrus. "What should we do with them?" "Give them to Jordan's post. There is a jail that is under guard and there they can await trial," said Dale as he turned now to Charles. "They should be given a chance for forgiveness if they sincerely ask for it. Their lives will then be in the hands of those they wronged." Charles didn't want to argue and knew they had just a short walk back into town. Harmon told Bayrin and Dalrus to jump on his back and if they tried anything, then he would be their executioner before they entered the town. Charles picked up William and draped him over Harmon's back in front of the two young men. He then held the baby and took one of the daggers from the mustache man known as Yamino as extra protection in case they ran into any more trouble. It was nearly sundown when they returned to Jordan's post and there they were greeted by the townsfolk. They had never seen a hiatus bear before and some even cowered at the sight of Harmon's mass, yet alone his long claws and sharp teeth. Just before they turned to face Jordan's post prison, Camille and her husband Turin came running towards them. "Is that my child? Is he all right?" screamed Camille and Charles offered the baby to her and she instantly started sobbing tears of relief. The husband looked at his youngest son and then to Charles and threw his arms around him in a gratifying hug. "I'm sorry for how I came across earlier," said Turin, still holding Charles. It's fine. This is what I do," Charles responded. Turin let Charles go and that's when he noticed his son Bayrin wearing the red robes that the servants of Errol wore. "You," he said furiously and then Turin acted like he wanted to rip his own son apart. The crowd gave a shudder and Camille screamed after her husband and Charles wasn't quick enough to hold him back. Turin was about to leap onto the back of Harmon, but the bear had no intentions of letting his captive seek judgment without a trial first. Harmon swirled his large head around and gave Turin a deep roar that everyone could feel in their chest. "We'll take it from here, Turin," said a voice and an older man was now coming out of the prison and walking towards them. He wore clothes that looked much like a suit, black and white and a pair of glossy black boots. So, what in the name of the Creator happened? Charles filled him in on everything. The golden orbs that would materialize into a scene, so as to prove that he was a lawman. The deaths of Jor and Yamino, and explained how they were the chains in the servants of Errol. The old man eyed William, who was still knocked out and was lying over the front of Harmon's back. Bayrin and Dalrus had jumped off Harmon, and there were a pair of guards that had put their wrists in iron chains like handcuffs. Charles explained how William must know how to wield magic, and that he was a captain for the servants of Errol, and that he was trying to fuse Errol's soul with the child's soul in order to live unsuspectedly with this world. "That's the best damn story I think I have ever heard," said the man. "Well, detective, on behalf of Jordan's Post and myself, Thaddeus Green that is, I bid you welcome to our town, and anything you need while you're here is on me." The crowd cheered, and Camille then rushed over to hug Charles as she was crying tears of joy. That's when Charles noticed that Dale was no longer with them. He looked through the crowd and could see no sign of him, but that's when he saw him. Far away from the people and leaning up against a tree, smoking his pipe and looking at Charles. Dale raised his pipe in the air and vanished.